Hi guys, this is Pentala Harikrishna against Alireza Firoujza from Tata Chess 2021 round 8. Harikrishna had white and he opened it with a d4 and came d5, c4, c6 to Slav, and after c takes d5, c takes d5, which is the exchange variation, which is quite a dry and drawish choice from Harikrishna. Perhaps he had some preparation in mind, as he now went for a sideline with bishop f4, knight c3 is the main move. So knight c6 just developing, e3 and bishop f5, getting the bishop outside of the pawn chain before playing e6, and now bishop b5 pinning the knight, so e6, knight c3 and knight g e7 to support the knight and preserve black's pawn structure in the event of bishop takes c6, and enabling a later a6 to put the question to the bishop, as well as retaining the option of playing f6 and e5 later, which of course is not possible if the knight develops to f6 instead. So rook c1 from Harikrishna is taking control of the c-file, and both players are of course just simply developing naturally. There's not much tension into position compared to normal, because Harikrishna chose the exchange variation, which takes some tension out of it, and as a result black has pretty much equalized already. So a6, now bishop e2, wants to preserve the bishop pair, and Firoujza continues with f6, which is preparing to expand in the center with e5, and Harikrishna responds energetically with g4. So bishop g6 is best, and now knight f3. And white can play for a small edge here instead with h4 immediately, with ideas like h5 and after bishop f7, knight f3 and g5 coming next. And gaining this much space on the king side would give white a significant edge, although black of course can defend if he's given the moves. But knight f3 is what Harikrishna played. Then we had bishop f7 and now bishop g3, which is a bit of a surprising choice after playing the aggressive g4, and black is now doing fine after h5, which is what Firoujza played. White should play instead h4 for a small edge. The point is that now after h5, g5 is good for white. So in the game continuation, after bishop g3, h5, g5 is of course still possible, but now black has the option of playing h4, and obviously he can't do that if white has played h4 first, and that's what black should do here. But Firoujza instead played knight g6, and white is now better after h4. So h4 is what Firoujza should have played, and for example knight h4, f takes g5. And if instead bishop takes h4, then knight f5, bishop g3 and f takes g5. Some nice dynamic ways for black to keep the balance in the position. But anyway, knight g6 is what Firoujza played, and Harikrishna responded with g takes f6, which is actually missing his chance here. Best was h4, maintaining the kingside space before taking action elsewhere, for example with queen b3 next. So g takes f6 is what was played, and now h4. Firoujza finds the best move. This is a temporary pawn sacrifice that's gonna win the bishop pair. After f takes g7, bishop takes g7, bishop e5 is, I guess you could call it the human move. The engine prefers bishop f4, and after knight takes f4, e takes f4, but no human player in their right mind wants to allow this weakened pawn structure on the dark squares after giving up their dark squared bishop. In particular, the d4 pawn is very weak and pressured, and black has ideas like queen b6, queen f6 immediately taking aim at these pawns. So white's up a pawn, but he can't keep it after, for example, queen f6, rook g1, bishop h6, knight a4, and bishop takes f4, rook c3, with an equal but unclear position. So bishop e5 is what Harikrishna actually did play. So knight g takes e5, d takes e5, knight takes e5, and now knight d4, which is getting the knight to a nice central square. It's putting pressure on e6, and it has ideas like f4 or rook g1 next. And he's given up the bishop pair, but his position is solid and playable, and the h4 pawn is weak for black. Firoujza has played the opening well to reach this position, and black is certainly equal after rook c8 and white castling. And it's a little scary to castle into this open g-file, but it's not easy for black to create threats there very quickly. So knight c6, and Firoujza undevelops his knight, but he does so with tempo because he's now threatening to play knight takes d4, and after c takes d4, queen f6, asking white how he defends the pawn on d4. And note that black should not play instead queen g5 check. It would be a case of Apatsa seeing a check and giving a check. Simply king h1, and white actually now has an edge with the huge threat of knight e4, attacking the queen and discovering an attack on the rook on c8, and white is winning after, for example, rook takes c1, queen a4 check, b5, bishop takes b5, a takes b5, queen takes b5, knight d7 is best. Now rook takes c1 is strongest, although white can just take the queen instead if he wants, but after this move the queen is still attacked. The knight can't be taken because of the pin between the queens, and white is threatening to mate with a rook c8 and then knight c6. So queen d8 is forced here, but then comes knight d6 check, and king e7 is again running into knight c6, so king f8 is forced, and now simply rook c8 is winning for white. So you should not give a check just when you see a check. So knight c6 is what Firoujza played, and then bishop g4 is how Harikrishna continued. So it's adding pressure to e6, but Firoujza is of course happy to take on d4 and create a target there with the pawn after e takes d4. And now he plays rook c6, overprotecting e6 and ensuring that the rook is not left undefended on c8 before going after the d4 pawn. If black rushes with that idea, then he gets into trouble. For example, queen b6, knight takes d5, exploiting this loose rook. And if queen f6, then knight e4 again is a very problematic move. So rook c6, and now knight e2 from Harikrishna. And this is the best move, although it's a little bit passive. It's supporting d4, so that's the main idea. Firoujza continued with h3. He's just planting a thorn in white's side, although the engine does not want to allow a rook takes c6, and therefore now prefers queen g5. And this more or less forces h3 due to the pressure on the rook here and also on the bishop. And for example, rook takes c1, queen takes c1, queen takes c1, rook takes c1, and now king d7 with just a small edge for black going into this endgame with the bishop pair and white's weakened pawn structure. So h3 and rook c3. Harikrishna wants to go after this weak h3 pawn, although as I mentioned the engine instead prefers rook takes c6. After b takes c6, queen c2 with pretty much an equal position. But rook c3 is what Harikrishna played, so rook h4 attacking the bishop, and rook g3 is best, and white has to be careful about how he defends due to being weak on the dark squares. If instead knight g3 and queen g5 attacking the bishop a second time more or less forces f3, and then rook takes c3, b takes c3, queen e3 check, king h1, queen takes c3, and black is definitely better. Or after rook h4, another possibility is bishop f3, but now queen g5 check, king h1, rook takes c3, b takes c3, now bishop f8, with the idea bishop d6 is strong, and black again has a nice edge in this position. So rook g3, now queen c7, just taking control of the open file and preparing a later e5 to expand in the center and liquidate this weak e6 pawn. So Harikrishna continued with rook e1, and he's playing well, and the position is still completely equal, although it definitely feels more comfortable and more coordinated for black, and the strength of the g7 bishop compared to the e2 knight is certainly clear. And you can instead play bishop takes h3 here, but it allows bishop h5, and black has enough play here to win back the pawn, so there's no need to rush in taking that h3 pawn. It's not going anywhere. So king f8 is how Firouzza continued. He's just getting his king out of the firing line on the e-file and protecting the bishop from a little bit of pressure from the rook. So queen d3, and Harikrishna is making good solid moves and ensuring Firouzza will not have active play before he takes on h3, avoiding things like the pin as we saw a second ago. So e5, and black's very happy to play this move and eliminate white's center. And here Harikrishna goes slightly wrong and elects to get the queens off with queen a3 check, and after queen d6, queen takes d6, rook takes d6, and now he finally takes the pawn. But black gets e takes d4, and he's just slightly better going into the endgame with the two bishops, despite the weak doubled pawns in the center. And Harikrishna is obviously planning on blockading and attacking those pawns, because he plays knight c1 now, just aiming for knight d3 and a blockade, and then he's going to hope to build up pressure on those pawns later on. And black now has a few options, like rook e4 is one, and also bishop g6 to hinder this knight d3 is another one, and Firouzza elected for rook dh6, which is another very good idea here. It's going to win a pawn after the bishop moves. So bishop g2, rook takes h2, now knight d3, and Firouzza brings the rook back. He wants to play rook c6 to take control of this file, but obviously he has to retract the rook on h2 first. And now f4, and this is a definite mistake from Harikrishna, and black is better. He should play instead knight c5, and after, for example, b6, knight d7, king g8, and rook e7 threatening knight e5. This keeps the balance in the position. So after f4, rook c6 taking control of the file. Now bishop f3 hitting the rook, so rook h6, and now rook g2, which is prophylaxis against black penetrating on the second rank, and now rook hg6, just challenging white's control of the g file, although the engine preferred to take advantage of white's last move instead with rook h3, and for example rook f1, and now bishop h6 with a definite edge for black. So rook hg6 anyway, and now f5, which is attacking the rook and enabling a later knight f4, which is Harikrishna's idea, although it's flawed, as we'll see in a moment. So rook h6. Now rook takes g2 instead, and black loses much of his edge after king takes g2. He needs to keep pieces on the board. So rook h6, and now knight f4, and it's of course very tempting to get the knight to this what seems to be an excellent square, especially with tempo, because it's attacking d5, but this is actually a blunder, and if you want to try and figure out black's best response, then stop the video now. d3 is the move, which is a pawn sacrifice to clear the square for the bishop. So knight takes d3 is how Harikrishna responded, and we can see what Firouzza is thinking here after he plays d3. The threat is a bishop d4 check, and how is black meant to defend? If he plays king f1, he's running into rook h1 is going to be mate, the following move, and in fact the only way to avoid the mate is rook f2, which is immediately losing the exchange, but that's the least of white's worries, because now comes d2 with rook c1 next, and it's game over. Black's dominance on the dark squares would be decisive, and as we saw, Harikrishna took the pawn, and that's the best defense. So we can see why other moves don't work. for example, bishop takes d5, and now bishop d4 is forcing rook f2 again to avoid mate, but now rook c2, and for example, rook ef1, bishop takes d5, knight takes d5, and rook h5 is crushing. Another possibility, instead of bishop takes d5, is knight takes d5, as he's obviously played to attack this pawn, but it doesn't work. After bishop takes d5, bishop takes d5, now bishop d4 check again, rook f2, and rook c2 is just crushing. So Harikrishna did find the correct defense, which is to play knight d3, and Firouzza now continues with bishop d4 check, and suddenly his play to win the bishop pair in the opening has become decisive, and black is dominating white on the dark squares. So one of the benefits of playing knight takes d3 is that he now has the defensive move knight f2, and this is the best defense. So now rook c2, which is threatening to take on b2 and also to play rook h4 f4, and after the bishop moves, f2 is falling. And this is actually such a strong threat that white has to abandon the b2 pawn and break the pin with king f1. So rook takes b2, and now rook e2, simply to defend the a2 pawn. Obviously white can't let his whole queenside pawns collapse. So rook b1 check, rook e1, and rook h b6, and this move actually lets white off the hook a little bit. Stronger was simply rook takes e1, king takes e1, king e7, and a big endgame advantage, probably winning. So rook h b6, now knight d3, and bishop c3 attacking the rook, which is tied to the first rank because this rook has pinned it. It pretty much forces rook takes b1. So now rook takes b1, king f2, and white has survived to an endgame, but he's a pawn down. His remaining pawns are weak, and black is still enjoying and very much making use of the bishop pair. So king e7, Firouzza gets his king active as fast as he can, and now we're in the endgame. Rook h2, king f6, just putting pressure on the pawn. King e3, and now king g5, taking control of some key squares and immediately getting his king active. Playing instead king takes f5 allows bishop takes d5, bishop d5, rook h5 check, king e6, knight f4 check, and white should probably be able to draw. So king g5, and now knight c5, and after weathering the middle game storm, Harikrishna wants to get active, but this is a small mistake. He should play instead rook h7, and white is holding after, for example, d4 check, king e4, bishop takes a2, rook h5 check, king f6, rook h6 check, king g7, and now rook d6, with the idea of playing f6 next, and this should be enough to draw. So knight c5 is what Harikrishna did play, and now rook b5, which is a small inaccuracy from Firouzza in return. Simply b6 instead was stronger because it forces knight b3, and then rook b2 next is a very strong way to play. And note that white can't play knight takes a6 because of d4 check, king d3, and now rook e1 is threatening rook e3 check, winning the bishop. So for example, bishop e2, and now b5, but bishop c4 is just crushing. So rook b5 from Firouzza, now rook h7 attacking the bishop, so bishop g8 and rook c7 just supporting this knight and retaining the pressure on b7. King takes f5, Firouzza is now 2 pawns up, but is still not completely winning. However, Harikrishna now blundered with knight takes b7, and he's obviously played to take this pawn, and the fact that he's threatening knight d6 check, winning the exchange, is an added incentive, but it's a serious mistake. He had to play king d3 to try and keep the balance. So knight takes b7, now d4 check, and suddenly black is winning after this move. And to make matters worse, Harikrishna blundered again with king f2. King d3 was better, but it's kind of a scary move to play because of rook b2 threatening rook d2, which is going to be mate, but white can defend, but he has to give up a piece. Knight d6 check, king f4, knight e4 defends the mate, but simply king takes f3, knight takes c3, d takes c3, rook takes c3, and rook a2 is going to be winning for black. So king f2 anyway is what Harikrishna played, and now rook b2 check. And Harikrishna continued with bishop e2, and now Firouzza did play king f4. Also possible was bishop d5 with the threat of d3, or just playing d3 right away, exploiting this pin. It drops the bishop, but it doesn't actually matter, because we can see you have to find the right move at the end. But rook takes c3, rook takes c2 check, king f1, and now rook e3 is enough to win easily, but you have to find rook e3. It's the only move that wins. So king f4 anyway is what Firouzza played. So knight d6 and now bishop d2, which is a small inaccuracy from Firouzza, but he's clearly found a winning idea and he's sticking to it, and it does of course still win. The most accurate move was bishop e6 with the threat of d3, and this is actually forcing mate, albeit in 23 moves. So yeah, bishop d2 is what Firouzza played. And now king f1, and Harikrishna is collapsing, but he was lost in any case. Knight c4 put up a little bit more resistance. For example, rook c2, bishop d3, bishop e3 check, king f1, rook c1 check, king e2, but now bishop e6 is again crushing. So king f1 anyway. Now rook b1 check, bishop d1, giving up the bishop would check, although it doesn't actually have to be taken, and Firouzza didn't take it. He played d3 instead, and this is actually forcing mate, and it's much stronger than snapping off the bishop with check. And Harikrishna resigned here as he has no defense. So it was a brilliant display by Firouzza, who played dynamically in the opening to win the bishop pair, then used it to apply pressure on the dark squares and force mistakes in the middle game, and finally played a crushing endgame to convert the edge that his play had gained. So it's a really great performance. I hope you enjoyed it. Please smash those like and subscribe buttons if you did, and I'll see you next time.